Hello and welcome to Real Talk, Come Follow Me. I'm Ganel-Lyn.
I'm Scott Sorensen.
We are in Jacob this week. Jacob 1 through 4, being reconciled unto God through the atonement of Christ, which is code for we're going to talk about the uncomfortable stuff today.
It is,
So get your waders on or whatever.
General Conference is only a few weeks away. I wanted to make mention of that just simply because obviously getting prepared for conference is important. But one of the things that from last conference, President Nelson gave some really bold, beautiful invitations for the women specifically in women's conference to DNC 25, 84, and 107.
And we taped special episodes here at Real Talk.
So you did you've done 2 episodes.
Right.
One of them you did on your own.
Part 1 was me, and then part 2 was Alyssa Edwards, and it was amazing.
Yeah, so if you haven't been able to get to that invitation to fulfill that, I would really encourage you to do it and let Ganel-Lyn and Alyssa help you with that.
But there was another invitation as well to prepare in studying the restoration.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything
Joseph
else?
Smith's first vision, especially in the Pearl of Great Price. And so, yeah, just a reminder on those. Whatever you can get to, I just wanted to mention that Ganel-Lyn can help you with that.
And I appreciate that. Yeah. And I think it's going to be I know it's going to be a wonderful conference. So
for sure.
We're excited about that. So here we are, Jacob 1.
Yes.
And Jacob was teaching. I think he was very much clear on what his why was. He was at the temple, and he, I think, had gotten a very bold assignment from the Lord. Have you ever had that prompting where you're like, maybe in seminary teaching or in callings where you're like, I've got to bring up some stuff, and it's going to be a little uncomfortable. I feel like Jacob really was clear on his why, and I think it's important to know what our whys are. I think verse 7 specifically in Jacob 1 was the why, and I think it's important to know as we go into what he's about to bring up is he's feeling compelled by the Lord. And I think about a devotional President Nelson gave at BYU recently, probably not recently, but in the last year, that he said sometimes prophets are going to say stuff that doesn't make us happy, that doesn't feel comfortable. And so I think that stood out to me, that Jacob was very much acting on an invitation at this point. Yeah,
and I love how it goes. It starts like verse 7, and then you go to verse 19, and then we get that great phrase of magnifying the Lord that we talk a lot about. And often when I think about this, I think about magnifying the Lord as in allowing the Lord to magnify you in your unique talents and gifts, because what happens that's amazing is our divinity then shows through, and he shows through us. So as we allow him to magnify us, then we're actually just magnifying him for other people, which I think is really great, especially when it's within our own uniqueness, within our own gifts, and not trying to
be like other people.
Like, if you get called into as a Relief Society president, you don't try and be like the last one. You be like you.
I think
magnify you.
This is perfect. We are very aware that there are a lot of Come Follow Me resources out there.
And a lot of them are so good.
So great. And when we started Real Talk, we heard from a lot of people, and some people were just so excited that we were kind of doing something unique, and then other people tried to get us into comparisons with some of the other great resources. And some of the other people creating content around Come Follow Me have been so supportive of us, and we are supportive of them. And I think when we were discussing this episode, we thought, what if we had just fallen into a trap of trying to be like someone else? We wouldn't have brought what we think uniquely we wanted to bring to this. And I love that idea of, especially in the church when we have assignments that rotate, and you know who the previous bishop was or who the previous primary president was. And I love that the Lord shakes things up, and he is saying, magnify. I think it means not to hustle. That was one of the thoughts that I had, is that when we start to hustle, we're trying sometimes to be like someone else, and we miss the boat, and then we aren't that like window into God. We're becoming something bigger, we're puffing up, or we're shrinking. And that's a good sign for me that I'm not magnifying or standing in my sacred space.
I love that. So it's not to hustle, but to magnify.
It's not to hustle. To magnify doesn't mean to make it bigger, to puff up. I think of Once Upon a Beehive movie, which I love. My daughter and I laugh all the time, but they build an actual ark. And after that movie, I was in the bathroom and there were women crying because they had been the camp leaders that actually built an ark for their young women's camp. And I'm not trying to take away from the people that actually did that, but I think we think when we hear the word magnify that the Lord is saying, you know, you really need to just like destroy your life trying to serve in this calling.
Yeah.
And whether it's at home or at work or as a mom or as a dad, I know right now I'm a mom of a teenage daughter, and I don't really always know what that looks like. And even as a wife, I have this amazing patient husband that sometimes I'm like, am I showing up for you in the way, and just asking your family, like, am I magnifying this calling? And really, my daughter, I asked her that the other day, and she said, just spending time, just show up. So are we making our callings too big? Are we trying to make it a hustle? I don't think that's what the Lord wants us to do.
Yeah, and I think really managing expectations with that is, and I think we just need to simply pray about that. Heavenly Father, help me to see me. Help me to see the version of me that you called. And sometimes I think people are like, I need to grow into this calling. And a lot of times I think, maybe not. I mean, callings will naturally allow us to grow, but often I think he called you right now.
Right.
He's good with you right now.
Yeah.
Just continue.
And maybe that's
don't let the calling necessarily try and turn you into something you're not.
And don't you think this is the perfect reason why God asked Jacob to do this? I feel like he knew exactly Jacob's personality. And so as we go into chapter 2,
it gets real.
It gets very real talk.
Yeah.
So Jacob is weighed down. Verse 3 says that he's weighed down because of the office of his calling, and it's because he knows he's concerned about the welfare of the people. He knows what's happening, and he's coming to them with this concern that is grieving his soul. And he says it's causing him to shrink with shame. And I love talking about shame anytime I can, because shame to me is one of the great indicators of, are we repenting and moving forward, or are we getting stuck? Because the adversary loves shame. And so I love that Jacob pushes through and says, no, I'm going to have some real talk with you about sexual sin and concubines. And to me, I'm going to try to say this in as tender of a way. This chapter has spoken to my soul in some very specific times in my life. Verse 31 talks about how God hears the cries of women. And I hear stories. I have the sacred opportunity to have people share with me really openly when I go out to speak, or they've read one of my books, to share their stories with me. And I often hear the cries of women. And verse 35 talks about the broken hearts of these tender wives. And I just really have felt that this episode, that there are women that are watching that are feeling like maybe God isn't hearing them. And so I really hope that if you're going through a really challenging time in a marriage, or because some of the things that Jacob talks about, maybe you've been abused or you've been violated in some way, and that trauma has come up and you're not really sure how God feels about it. Oftentimes I hear stories of individuals where their abusers have gone on and it looks like God is not even holding them accountable. I believe Jacob was saying, I hear you and see you, and God hears you and sees you, and this is not okay. One of my favorite words that you hear even in the temple is enmity. And enmity is God saying righteous anger is appropriate. If you're going to hurt my daughters, if you're going to hurt children, I'm not okay with that. And this chapter has been important to me in healing and validation. This is the validation from God chapter. And Jacob is bold, and he is saying, not okay. And you shared with me the Lord of hosts. And do you want to talk about that?
I had a colleague of mine share this with me, and it's in the text what you're talking, that God is a God of boundaries. There comes a point where he says, this cannot happen. We've got to fix this. And so we often think of the Savior, we want him to be loving, compassionate, kind, forgiving. We want him, those attributes are so endearing.
Right.
Like you talked about in the last episode about my Jesus.
Right.
And that's what I picture, is this comforting, consoling Jesus, and he is for those women. However, if you start in verses 28 through 33, Jacob uses the title Lord of Hosts 6 times in 6 verses. This Lord of Hosts is not that Lord.
Nope. This
is a different version, a title of the Savior. He's the Lord of armies. He is a captain of an army. And if you think about that should instill a little bit of, this is dead serious. And I think that can be really comforting to some of those sisters that are feeling like...
And brothers. I know that there are male individuals, sons of God, that have been violated and hurt and abused. And I feel like, Scott, you taught me something so new when you shared with me Lord of Hosts. I've read that. I have never stopped to think, like, Lord of Hosts. What is he host? What is the host that is being referenced here? I love that teaching.
Yeah, I think it can be very, very useful for both victims and perpetrators.
Yeah.
Is that the right way of saying it? I think that it can be really useful to say, hey, you've got to deal with this immediately, and then also for others to say, no, the Lord is also a captain of armies, and when he needs to be, he can really come in and set boundaries.
And boundaries are loving. God is a very boundaried individual, and we often think that if we're trying to hold a boundary with an individual that maybe we have in our family or at work or whatever, that it's not feeling safe, that somehow we're not being loving. And I think this is a really important indicator that God is a fan of boundaries. Do you want to tackle plural marriage? Because I think we're real talk, and once again, we're going to jump into the deep end a little into a complex issue.
So I'll say this again. I said it on a previous episode when we were talking about all are alike unto God, both bond and free, male and female, black and white. We were talking about race and gender and some of those things. With plural marriage, again, this is another one where I don't feel like I need to speak authoritatively about it. So the way I approach this, and
because you have never lived plural marriage.
I don't know. And I'm not a female. I know this affects women much different than it does men. But what I will say about this is, so then what do you do? What do I do? What I do is I find people who this affected specifically, and then read their stories, specifically the women in church history who dealt with this, and how they dealt with it in faith. And so there's a few places you can go. There's 3 essays the church has written on plural marriage, and then there's also a really great website called Joseph Smith's Polygamy, where Laura and Brian Hales they go through and tell these stories. They put them out there, these journals, and I think it's important rather than me saying how they should have felt in our church history. Let me separate this from what Jacob's dealing with. Unauthorized polygamy with Jacob versus authorized polygamy with Joseph Smith and the early saints.
And that's a very important distinction.
That is the biggest distinction, by the way.
That is, because really, my husband and I had a chance. I went and spoke in the Middle East a few years ago, and I have not talked about it very publicly, but he was with me, and I didn't even know there were that many versions of bacon. There's turkey bacon, chicken bacon, there's beef bacon, because bacon and pork is still an issue in that area because of religion. And yet in our religion, alcohol is the no-no. It's not bacon. We can have a BLT or a bacon hamburger and be fine. And I bring that up because that's a policy change. And so Jacob was saying the policy right now is no polygamy. In Joseph Smith's time, it was okay. And I love that you brought this up. And I would just say, in preparation for conference, what our family has done in really understanding the restoration is reading the Saints book. And you and I talked about this. I love how the Saints book has been laid out. It is unapologetic. It's told in story form. So seventh grade.
It's messy.
It's messy.
I read it, and some of those stories I was like, oh.
Literally, the Nauvoo chapters and the polygamy stuff. There's not a commentation about it. Is that the right way to say it? The commentary? There's not a commentary about that.
You should think about it this way.
Right. It tells the story, and sometimes we would end a chapter as a family, and our family would have real talk about it. It was like, okay, that was uncomfortable. Okay, that was human. That was very human.
And that's in the New Saints book. It really covers the Brigham Young time period, which was where we get the bulk of these stories. And so I would just recommend, instead of us telling people how they should feel about their own experience, maybe we should read it and go from there. I found some useful lessons learned from doing that.
And hopefully you're having real talk in your families, and this subject is being brought up within the context of your home this week because of Come Follow Me.
And be okay that some people, this will bother them for a long time. And I think let's so not be judgmental about that or dismissive about the feelings of others.
Can I say, the Spirit's prompting to share this, I call certain things in the gospel, in the church, my backburner issues. and they don't stay in the front of the stove. I don't have all the answers around them. Polygamy has been in the past one of those. Race in the church has been one of those, and I talked about that from my experience. And so when you put something on the back burner, you're not taking it off the stove. You're not saying it doesn't exist, but it's not going to stop me from progressing in my conversion process every day. And I'm going to revisit it when the Spirit directs. And I think that's important to note, that we're not going to ignore the real talk issues, but you may have to pull them off a shelf or pull them from the back burner sometimes.
I'm totally going to use that in seminary and not give you credit. Just so you know, I'm telling you up front. Thank you. And before we leave this subject, let me just say one quick thing. So when the Book of Mormon was originally written, it was in paragraph form.
Right.
So verse 35 ends a paragraph. Jacob 3 verse 1 just starts a new paragraph. So don't let the chapter heading get in the way of the context.
This is important.
Because the next 2 verses in Jacob, he says twice to the victims. He turns to the victims in this situation and he calls them, "You are pure in heart." And I think when he said that, I imagine Jacob got choked up. And I imagine him saying, "You're pure in heart." And I think that's why he repeated it twice, because he felt like, I need to make sure that you understand this is not your fault. You are not dirty or unclean because of what they did to you. And your children aren't, although there's wreckage and there's a difficulty in this, it doesn't mean you're dirty. And he even uses the word console in there as well. I don't know how to say this with more power, but I just want you to know you are pure, you are pure, you are pure. And Jake, I want to echo those words because I think they are so powerful. And that feeling of someone did this to me and now I'm unrecognizably broken and inherently broken, that is so unconsoling. And I think Jacob right off the bat just says, no, you are pure.
I love the tenderness. I also feel the power of that, because I think if you have been abused and violated in any way, it is such a confusing wrestle in your soul about what part was what the perpetrator did to you, and then that shame factor that can come up. And I love that Jacob was bold and that you were bold. Scott, thank you for doing that. And I think that leads us into Jacob 4 before we end. I love verse 7. It's my personal inventory, step 4. If you do 12-step, if you've done any 12-step work, that taking a personal inventory and seeing your brokenness, it's this grace verse that I love. I have a broken rake hanging in my house, and it's a reminder. I put it up on the wall because the rake to me is beautiful and unique. It's still useful, but it has a broken part, and we all have that. And the grace of Christ is really the subject heading of this whole week's study.
Yeah.
And that when we take a personal inventory, if you do step 4 in 12-step, it's a soul-wrenching process to
That's that self-awareness step, right?
It
Where
is.
you really have to dig in deep and deal with some uncomfortable things.
Yeah, and being really honest with yourself about where you've made mistakes and where you need the grace of Christ. Do you have anything?
The only thing I'll say is grace redefines everything. It redefines the way you look at pain. It can redefine the way you look at abuse. It can redefine the way you look at a divorce. It can redefine the way you look at misery.
Everything.
Grace redefines our entire perspective on how we approach mortality. And so I think this step it cannot be overstated. That idea of going through real soul-searching, self-awareness, because when you live in grace, it redefines everything through Christ.
And when
it makes one of the other verses says, always pointing us to Christ.
Right, because in this point, Satan will knock at the door. He doesn't have hands.
Yeah.
So can he knock? No.
That's interesting.
Yeah. He has no body. So he talks about all the body stuff, but Satan is constantly going to say to you, when you do an inventory, you're worthless.
Yeah.
And the other lie Satan will say is, who do you think you are? So then you turn to Christ, you accept his grace, and you feel hopeful, right? And then Satan is right there to whisper, who do you think you are? So I always know it's the adversary whispering at me when he's either when I'm having thoughts of, I'm a loser, or who do I think I am? I should not be doing a real talk show with Scott Sorensen, because
That's the adversary. And then also, you are a loser because you did this and this and this. So be careful, especially if you deal with depression or anxiety.
Yes.
The adversary will wiggle his way in every time. And that's why grace is so liberating, right? It's the hope in Christ. It changes everything.
It redefines mental illness.
Everything.
Yeah, everything it redefines.
Yeah.
So this week's invitation, I think, is the one you and I, maybe more than any of them, have felt the most strongly about. And I'm going to read this so I don't mess it up.
Okay.
What do you need to do to bring things that you've hidden in the darkness, to bring them into the light? To have no more secrets.
No more secrets.
No more secrets, no matter how painful it might be to get them out there.
Yeah.
This idea of no longer living in the dark, but bringing all to the light.
Scott and I, in preparation for this week's episode, boldly said if we did the whole show for this week's invitation only, it would have been worth it. And I shared with you a story about this exact thing that I invited through this same process, No More Secrets, from the stage one day. And it invited a man that was wrestling with a really big, horrible secret to disclose that to his wife. And it involved bringing the authorities in. It was that severe. And it was so powerful. So I love this invitation that the biggest way we can kick Satan out of our homes and our families is to say we are in a no secret zone. And that's what Jacob was saying this week. He was in these chapters, he was saying to his people, no more. Satan loves secrets. He lives on them. He feeds off them. And when we cut the secrets off, we literally take, like, in my mind, that's the fuel line, and we've cut it. And he doesn't have power. If we want to have uncomfortable, vulnerable conversations, there's gonna be anxiety around that. But the Spirit's gonna show up because the Lord loves it when we tell the truth. He lives on truth, and Satan lives on secrets. So no more secrets.
No more secrets.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for once again joining us on another episode of Real Talk, Come Follow Me. I'm Scott, this is Ganel-Lyn. Oh, and also, please feel free to follow us on
the gram.
On the gram.
Do we sound
We
cool?
sound so old. Old people trying to sound cool. Follow us on the gram. If you don't know what that is,
ask your kids.
ask your kids, and they won't know either.
Yeah. We have some good videos, some behind the scenes pics.
Yeah.
Pics.
Wow.
Gosh.
Our
What's
cool
our
factor just skyrocketed. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us.